It began, as so many things do in Oxford, with the weather. A drizzle that could not quite decide whether it wished to be rain or mist had descended upon the city, softening the edges of stone and memory alike. I had stopped beside St. Barnabas Chapel, not from faith but from habit, that incurable curiosity of mine which leads a man to pause, where there is music. Inside, a choir rehearsed. Their voices rose and fell like the breath of the building itself. I could not see them, only hear the faint echo through the heavy oak door, sopranos trembling at the upper vault, tenors sounding like ghosts trying to remember life. One voice, lighter than the rest, carried a note so pure I almost turned away. Perfection unsettles me. It implies something soon to be broken. A warden crossed the path, nodding to me with the weary civility of someone who has long known rain. I murmured a reply, though I doubt he heard it. Behind him, a car splashed through Broad Street. The sound was vulgar, a reminder that even in Oxford the century had advanced without our consent. I lit a cigarette and listened until the hymn faltered and dissolved into silence. Later that afternoon, over a mug of indifferent tea in my office, I found a small newspaper item, buried halfway down page 5, beneath a photograph of a counsellor opening something unimportant. Student found dead in university lodgings, foul play not suspected. I read it twice. The words were efficient, almost boring. The name Claudia Webb struck no chord of recognition, yet the accompanying detail did a note, written in Latin, found beside the body. I remember Lewis reading it aloud when he arrived. His voice carried that tentative deference he adopts when he suspects I'm already halfway down a path of thought. Omnia mutantur, nos et mutamur in illis. All things change, and we change with them. He shrugged, as if translating a riddle that ought to have remained in its own tongue. I said nothing, only stared at the phrase written neatly on the report. It was the hand, not the words, that troubled me. The careful loops, the unhurried pressure. A hand that had not trembled, not hesitated. Hardly the hand of a suicide. Lewis spoke again, suggesting we might let it rest if the coroner had ruled it clear. I half listened, hearing instead the ghost of that soprano note, lingering like smoke from a candle no one remembered lighting. There is something deeply unsatisfactory about the way Oxford tidies away its deaths. Even tragedy here must be submitted to form. I walked out into the evening. The streets were a constellation of puddles, each reflecting a window's yellow light. Students hurried past, burdened with books and certainties. Somewhere a bell chimed 7, slow and deliberate. I turned into Radcliffe Square, and the great dome loomed like a thought I could not finish. It would have been simple to forget the story of another young life folded neatly into the college annals. But simplicity has never been my forte. I found myself wondering what kind of girl wrote a Latin farewell. Perhaps she had studied under one of the more ambitious dons, the sort who sees mentorship as a kind of conquest. Or perhaps she was simply one of those souls who treat language as refuge, even at the end. At the corner by Holywell Street, a wind lifted the rain from the stones. I recalled a lecture I had once half listened to Ovid. Transformation, the cruelty of change. Mutantur. I said it quietly, testing the weight of it. Change. The one certainty Oxford denies. When I reached home, I poured myself a whiskey and read the notice again, the print already smudged where my fingers had lingered too long. I felt the faint, familiar prickle of irritation. Not with death, but with incompetence. Foul play not suspected. How generously we absolve ourselves when the dead cannot argue. That night I dreamed of music, of a voice that rose against the rain until it broke. In the morning, the sound still hovered somewhere behind my ears, impossible to name. I told myself it was nothing. But I knew even then that the girl with the Latin note would not be so easily dismissed. Lewis read the Latin phrase again, though he needn't have. It had already carved itself into the back of my mind like an engraving half-sanded from an old tombstone. Omnia mutantur, nos et mutamur in illis. All things change, and we change with them. I told him that much Latin I remembered without a dictionary, but not, perhaps, the courage to believe it. He asked whether I thought it meant something. I told him everything means something if one only looks long enough. He gave a small sigh that seemed to ask why I never settled for the obvious suicide. A note, the end of another lonely student story. But even as he spoke, I was turning the paper in my hand, tracing the ink's faint difference of tone, the careful way the lines curved as though written by a person unaccustomed to final gestures. The college itself had changed little since I first walked its quadrangles as a student. The same sandstone bleeding damp through the centuries, the same Latin carved above doorways like instructions for eternity. Claudia Webb had lived on the second floor of the north building, a narrow staircase smelling of varnish and old gowns leading to her rooms. A nervous maid, too tidy, let us in. It was the kind of room a mind might vanish in. Books lined the shelves without hierarchy. Classical texts, music scores, something on astronomy. The desk had been cleared, but too neatly. Grief does not straighten things. On the mantelpiece sat a framed photograph of a choir, St. Barnabas again, if I was not mistaken. I recognized the arched window behind them, and there, at the edge of the group, a young woman with a solemn face and the slight, apologetic poise of someone unaccustomed to being looked at. Lewis opened the wardrobe, more out of duty than expected. Nothing, the kind of nothing that had been arranged. On the desk lay a single page of lined paper, covered in neat handwriting. He said it looked like a translation exercise. I read it over his shoulder, Metamorphoses, Book 15. Ovid again. Transformation, the line underlined twice tempora mutantur, et nos mutamur in illis. She had copied it wrong, or rather, changed it. Omnia, not tempora. All things, not time. It was deliberate, the kind of small, precise alteration that always outlives the person who made it. We walked across to the quadrangle. Dr. Fairfax was waiting in his room, a man whose manner had been ironed so long it could never crease. He spoke warmly of Claudia, academically, and with that faint Oxfordian regret that sounds like sympathy but is really disappointment. He described her as brilliant, troubled, a girl inclined to see life through declensions. I smiled that only at Oxford could melancholy be grammatical. I asked him if she had enemies. He said she had admirers. The tone made the distinction unnecessary. As he spoke, my eyes caught a thin wisp of smoke curling from the ashtray beside his desk. A single cigarette stubbed out halfway. His hand trembled slightly when I asked whether he'd seen her on the day she died. He said no, but looked down as he said it. Lewis later called it nerves. I thought it was a memory. When we left, the rain had thickened to something resembling an apology. Lewis said the man seemed decent enough. I nodded, though I wasn't sure decency ever survived a locked door. Back in the car, I unfolded the Latin note once more. 2 inks, 2 shades. The first line pressed hard, the second faint, hesitant. It was not the work of one sitting, perhaps not even one person. Lewis switched on the radio, and a hymn emerged, blurred by static, the same tune I'd heard at St. Barnabas the day before. I told him to turn it off. The sound made the air feel too thin. I stared through the windscreen at the rain streaking the glass and thought how Oxford never allows the dead to leave. It only translates them into footnotes. Claudia Webb's Latin note would become one such epitaph unless I found the sentence that preceded it. It was raining again in the afternoon, so we went back to her room. Rain in Oxford is not weather, it is punctuation. It interrupts, delays, and somehow insists that everything must be read twice. Claudia Webb had lived above a tobacconist on Magdalen Street, in a building that leaned ever so slightly, as though the weight of its memories had begun to pull it down. The staircase was narrow, varnished long ago, and it gave off the faint smell of beeswax and loneliness. Lewis went ahead, his torch cutting small circles of light across the worn wallpaper. Inside, the air had the stillness of something recently disturbed and trying to appear otherwise. I've always distrusted tidy crime scenes, they tell too much. Her books were aligned with mathematical care, dictionaries, Ovid, several volumes on textual analysis. Each dust jacket gleamed faintly under the lamplight, not a single page marked. The diary, however, was open on the writing desk to a blank page. That was what drew my attention first. Blankness, especially deliberate blankness, is often louder than ink. Lewis, meanwhile, was looking at a half-finished bottle of Beaujolais. He said it looked like company. I said it looked like staging. There were 2 glasses, both washed, both faintly streaked with lipstick. Claudia's. Perhaps. Or perhaps not. The mirror on the mantelpiece reflected only one chair drawn to the desk. I remember thinking that Oxford had a way of disguising solitude as scholarship. A crossword lay on the table, its grid filled to 3/4. I scanned it idly. One clue in particular caught me. Change is the only constant 6. The answer, written in neat capitals, was mutatio, a clever Latin substitution and consistent with her interests. But there, beside it, in the faintest graphite pencil, was a marginal note check ink. I felt an involuntary twinge of curiosity. I leaned closer. The word mutation had been written twice, once in blue, once in black. It was small and perhaps meaningless, but I have found that meaning is rarely polite enough to announce itself. Lewis said something about coincidence. I told him Oxford doesn't believe in coincidence, only footnotes. There was also a photograph pinned above the desk of a group shot, the college choir again. She stood to one side, her face turned slightly away, caught in half-profile. What unsettled me was not her expression, but the smudge across her shoulder, as though someone had touched the photograph once too often and too tenderly. I opened a drawer. Inside were letters, mostly drafts of essays, and a few unopened envelopes, postmarked from Italy. Lewis read one of the return addresses aloud, mispronouncing it. I told him it belonged to Professor Rinaldi, a visiting scholar from Padua. The name lingered in my head longer than it should have. At the window, rain streaked the glass in fragile lines. Below, students passed under umbrellas, their laughter breaking against the wet stone like a kind of defiance. I wondered briefly whether Claudia had watched them that final evening, and whether she had envied them or pitied them. Lewis asked what I thought. I said I thought the room was too clean for grief and too arranged for despair. Someone had wanted this death to make sense, which of course was why it didn't. As we left, I turned once more to the desk. The diary remained open, its blank page unyielding, but tucked beneath it, barely visible, was the corner of another sheet torn, folded twice. I pulled it free. It contained only a few words, written in that same delicate hand. He mistranslated it on purpose. Lewis asked what it meant. I said I didn't know. But I did. Somewhere in the echo of that sentence, the first crack of truth had appeared. Translation, after all, is merely the art of choosing which lie sounds most like the truth. We stepped back into the rain. The city, indifferent and eternal, continued its quiet conversation with the river. I lit a cigarette, though it went out almost immediately. In Oxford, even fire concedes to water. There is a certain cruelty in academic precision, the way a lecture hall can become a confessional disguised as scholarship. I have sat through many, though rarely by choice. That afternoon I found myself once again beneath the carved ceiling of the Randolph Lecture Theatre, listening to Dr. Fairfax deliver his thoughts on Ovid and the tragedy of transformation. The title alone felt indecently appropriate. Fairfax stood at the lectern, tall, neat, and too aware of his own poise. He had the air of a man who had never misplaced a comma nor forgiven those who had. His voice carried easily through the room the kind of mellifluous authority that turns poetry into obedience. He spoke of change, of the gods' cruelty, of beauty devoured by intellect. I remember thinking that his tone belonged less to scholarship than to self-justification. The students listened, rapt. I watched their faces instead of the subtle shifts of admiration, envy, and incomprehension. Julia Henslow sat near the back, her eyes fixed not on the man but on the floor, as though she had already heard the words and was trying to forget them. Fairfax quoted the same Latin line found beside Claudia Webb's body. Omnia mutantur, nos et mutamur in illis. I could not help noticing the pause before he translated it, a pause too deliberate, as if memory required rehearsal. When he said the words aloud in English, the cadence matched almost perfectly the phrasing on the note. I felt, rather than thought, the alignment between them. Afterward, the applause came in the polite flutter that passes for reverence in Oxford. Fairfax smiled briefly, then spotted me standing by the door. The smile evaporated. He came over, his tone warm enough to conceal its temperature. "Detective," he said, or rather implied. "How gratifying to see that the police take an interest in Latin literature." I replied that death, like Ovid, is universal. He gave a small, self-approving laugh. Then he told me Claudia had been troubled but brilliant, that she had suffered from solitude, as though solitude were an illness curable by charm. He spoke as men often do when describing a woman whose intellect had once impressed them with the weary benevolence of one who believes admiration excuses complicity. I asked when he had last seen her. He said 3 days before her death, to discuss an essay. She had been distracted, he claimed, by something personal. When I pressed further, his eyes darted momentarily to the young Italian scholar standing near the exit, Professor Rinaldi. The gesture was quick, almost accidental, but I've always trusted accidents more than intention. We stepped outside. Rain again, of course, thin, steady, deliberate. Lewis had been waiting by the car, looking bored in that way he reserves for institutions. Fairfax lingered beside me under the colonnade, lighting a cigarette with unnecessary precision. He asked whether I thought it suicide. I told him I thought she deserved a better ending than convenience. His expression flickered, just once, like a match in a gust. I left him there, framed by the wet stone pillars and the faint curl of smoke. A man rehearsing composure. Back at the station, Lewis laid out the fragments we had. The note, the crossword, the diary page. He said it all pointed one way to Fairfax. I told him evidence rarely points to drifts. Still, I could not shake the echo of that lecture, the polished rhetoric masking something brittle. Later, I sat alone in my flat with a glass of claret that had lost its nerve. The radio murmured a slow movement from Elgar. I thought about Claudia Webb, the photograph, the choir, the faint penciled warning. He mistranslated it on purpose. Fairfax had quoted Ovid flawlessly that afternoon. Yet I was certain that when Claudia heard him speak, she had caught something amiss, a misstep in cadence, a word deliberately altered. It was a small thing, a matter of syntax perhaps, but fatal in its implications. Translation is the act of faith in disguise, and Fairfax had never struck me as a man of faith. The music deepened. Outside, Oxford glistened under the perpetual drizzle, its spires reflecting in the slick pavements like memories unwilling to fade. I drained my glass and reached for the newspaper cutting still folded in my pocket. Beneath the headline, "Student Found Dead in University Lodgings," a single sentence leapt out. Dr. Alan Fairfax declined to comment. I smiled, though it wasn't amusing. Declined a word that in Latin means both to bend and to refuse. Perhaps that was all he had done. Bent truth until it looked like pity. Refused to see what it became. He arrived without ceremony, which in Oxford is its own kind of distinction. Professor Marco Rinaldi, a name that suggested sunshine, espresso, and the sort of intellect that needs no introduction. He wore a raincoat that seemed to have absorbed our weather reluctantly, and carried an umbrella so polished it appeared ornamental. Lewis thought he looked harmless. I have never trusted men who seem too comfortable in borrowed climates. We met him in the senior common room, where he was finishing an espresso the size of regret. He stood as we entered, offered a courteous nod, and began to speak in that charmingly fractured English that can disguise more than it reveals. He had, he said, known Claudia Webb during her time abroad in Venice 2 years prior. She was bright, precise, too curious for her own peace of mind. The usual eulogies of intellect. I asked what had brought him to Oxford again. He smiled, not with warmth, but with calculation. Collaboration, he said. Dr. Fairfax and I are revising a joint paper on classical plagiarism, a subject, he added, with that irritating air of continental irony that has more relevance in England than you might imagine. Lewis noted the remark later, but at the time I was distracted by the cuff of his shirt. A faint brown stain, circular, near the wrist. Ink or wine. He gestured as he spoke, graceful, deliberate, as though performance were his first discipline. I asked whether he had seen Claudia recently. He shook his head. Not since she returned to Oxford, though he had received a very strange letter from her, he said. She accused someone of theft, intellectual theft. But the letter had arrived torn, half unreadable. He shrugged, a continental gesture that conveyed both weariness and discretion. I asked if he had kept it. Of course, he said, but it was lost during his travels. Things disappear, Inspector. People too. The phrase lingered longer than his smile. Lewis shifted beside me, impatient. I noticed how Rinaldi's fingers brushed the table when he spoke, tapping softly as if counting time in a piece of music only he could hear. The same rhythm repeated twice, then stopped abruptly when I mentioned the Latin note. He said he knew nothing of it, but his gaze faltered for a fraction of a second, a small misalignment, easily missed, but I had learned long ago to trust hesitation more than denial. When he left, Lewis muttered something about academics being all riddles and tea. I didn't answer. Outside, the rain had returned with unhelpful persistence, turning the cobblestones into a dull mirror. I watched Rinaldi cross the quad, his umbrella opening like a black flower. Fairfax appeared moments later at the far archway, calling after him, though the words were swallowed by distance. 2 men, 1 idea, and perhaps 1 secret too many. Later at the station, I spread the files across my desk. The photographs of Claudia's room, the crossword, the diary, the Latin note. I took out a small envelope I'd found earlier that morning, the torn one hidden behind her bookshelf, addressed in an unfamiliar hand. The postmark was Italian. Inside, only half a letter. The remaining words, fragmentary but eloquent, "You will ruin him as he ruined me." The proof lies in his lecture notes. He mistranslated the gods. The phrase drew a quiet ache of recognition. The gods, not the text, meaning concealed by scholarship. Lewis asked whether I thought the letter referred to Fairfax or Rinaldi. I said perhaps both. In Oxford, theft was rarely about money. It was about brilliance. And brilliance, like beauty, inspires equal measures of admiration and envy. That night I dined alone at the King's Arms, listening to the rain worry the windows. A student at the next table was attempting a crossword. His clue: one who borrows light but gives none back 6. He muttered the answer, then wrote it down. Moon. I smiled to myself that the line between reflection and theft is narrower than it appears. As I walked home through the drizzle, I found myself thinking of Claudia again, her careful handwriting, her unshaken hand, her Latin note. Perhaps she had seen something not meant to be seen. Perhaps she had realized that translation is never innocent. Outside my flat, the lamplight flickered against the wet pavement, and for a moment I imagined her voice again, the one from St. Barnabas, the voice that had begun all this. It rose faintly in my mind, fragile and precise, like a warning in a language I almost remembered. I've often thought that letters, more than people, hold the truer record of affection. We hide behind words when alive, but strip ourselves bare on paper, trusting the post to deliver what conscience cannot. Claudia Webb's correspondence, however, had learned to vanish. Louis and I found the hidden compartment by accident. It was late afternoon, the light thinning to that peculiar Oxford grey which blurs the boundary between dust and memory. He had been cataloguing her books when the shelf, slightly warped by damp, shifted under his weight. Behind it lay a hollow space barely large enough to fit a shoebox. Inside, 2 envelopes, both torn, one empty, the other half filled with a letter whose neat, slanted hand had already begun to fade. The first was addressed to Dr. Alan Fairfax. The postmark was from Venice 2 days before her death. The second, a smaller note, bore no name at all. Its Latin fragment read simply, Deus mutus est. God is silent. I remember tracing the words with my thumb, feeling their stillness. Louis said she must have been writing about theology. I said theology had nothing to do with it. The handwriting trembled at the edges, not with fear but restraint. A person trying very hard not to say too much. We took the envelopes back to the station. I read the letter beneath a desk lamp, the yellow circle of light making each word seem newly chosen. You are right about him. Betrayal among scholars is the purest kind. I have proof, but I must decide whether revelation redeems or destroys. Then it broke off mid-sentence, the bottom half missing. Louis wondered aloud whether Fairfax had destroyed the rest. I said perhaps he had never received it, or perhaps he had written the missing portion himself. Oxford breeds erasures more efficiently than any press. That evening I visited Fairfax's rooms again. He greeted me with exaggerated civility, poured a glass of claret neither of us wanted, and offered the usual academic condolences. How tragic, how brilliant she was, how unwell. His eyes flicked to the letter when I placed it on the table between us. He said he had never seen it. I told him I didn't believe in coincidence, only context. He smiled, thinly. You seem to suspect me of sentiment, Inspector. I'm not built that way. I said nothing. My attention was caught by a small detail, a stack of music scores beside his gramophone, Elgar and Purcell arranged alphabetically. But one folder was out of place. Monteverdi, Madrigals, Volume 3, a Venetian edition. Fairfax followed my gaze. His hand moved slightly, almost protectively. I remembered Claudia's phrase betrayal among scholars. It is a curious thing how the academic mind can rationalize theft as interpretation. When I left, the rain had begun again, the kind that makes the streets glisten like old ink. I walked without purpose until I reached the river. A pair of swans drifted near the bank, indifferent to human consequence. I envied them for their purity of instinct. Back at my flat, I unfolded the letter once more. The Latin phrase, Deus mutus est, caught the lamplight. God is silent. But silence, I thought, is only meaningful if someone has been speaking before it. I looked again at Claudia's handwriting, then at the postmark, faint but legible. It bore the same smudge as the ink on Fairfax's lecture notes. Louis telephoned an hour later. He had been checking postal records. There had been a third letter sent from Oxford to Italy a week earlier. Same handwriting, same return address. Lost in transit, they said. lost as if paper could simply disappear. I poured myself another drink and watched the condensation form on the glass. Outside, the street lamp flickered uncertainly. I found myself thinking not of Claudia, but of that peculiar human tendency to send our confessions into the world, hoping they arrive at the wrong door. In the morning, I would go back to the college and look again at the library archives. But that night, the phrase would not leave me. God is silent. Perhaps he was. But in Oxford, it was never the silence that frightened me. It was the echo that came after. The trouble with evidence is that it behaves too much like people it insists on being interpreted. By that stage of the investigation, I'd gathered enough fragments to fill a drawer, and yet none of them fit together without protest. The Latin note, the letter from Venice, the crossword, Fairfax's lecture, the visiting Italian, all separate brushstrokes that refused to form a picture. Lewis believed we had our culprit. He said it with the certainty of youth, that comfortable conviction that guilt can be measured by proximity. Fairfax, he argued, had motive, means, and the unmistakable air of a man with something to hide. I told him that men who look guilty often are only tired. We sat in my office late into the evening. The typewriter on the desk beside us was broken, the ribbon wound too tight, an unintentional metaphor. I unfolded Claudia Webb's crossword again. The grid had begun to haunt me, the small boxes forming a silent logic that mocked my own. My eyes fell once more on the clue she had left half-finished. The truth, when translated, loses color 5. I filled in the letters slowly, trying combinations aloud in my head. Fraud came to mind, but it felt too coarse, too blunt. Then another word surfaced, shade. Truth loses color. Translation, too, changes shade. It was not a solution, it was an echo. But in echoes one sometimes finds the shape of what is missing. Lewis said he'd been to see Rinaldi again. The man had vanished from his lodgings that morning, leaving behind an unpaid bill and a half-empty bottle of Chianti. Vanishing is the oldest form of confession, but also the most ambiguous. I told Lewis to check train stations and hotel registers. I meanwhile intended to visit Julia Henslow. Her room smelled faintly of turpentine and lilies. She was sitting by the window, reading a book of Italian verse. I asked whether she had known Claudia well. She said everyone in college knew that was the problem. Too clever, too fearless. She spoke as though intellect were an unforgivable sin. She mentioned, almost carelessly, that Claudia had been obsessed with accuracy, especially in translation. A single mistranslated word, she once said, could destroy a life. I asked whether she referred to Fairfax or to Rinaldi. Julia smiled, but it was a smile without joy. Both, perhaps. Oxford is built on borrowed sentences. When I returned to my flat, the rain had begun again. I sat by the window, notebook open, and watched the lamplight distort on the wet pavement. My notes looked like confessions written by someone else's hand. I poured a small measure of whiskey and tried to think of nothing, which is harder than it sounds. At some point, I found myself staring again at the Latin note, omnia mutantur, nos et mutamur in illis. All things change, and we change with them. The ink fascinated me. I had already noticed 2 shades, but now, under lamplight, a third seemed to glimmer faintly, a paler line, barely visible, running through one of the letters, almost as if the words had been traced over an earlier draft. I fetched a magnifying glass. The lower layer was slightly misaligned, a ghostly shadow beneath the final version. The handwriting, though similar, was not identical. 2 hands had written the same line, one perhaps correcting, the other claiming. I felt a small surge of that cold excitement, particularly to discover the kind that arrives like a whisper you almost mistake for doubt. The next morning I told Lewis. He asked what it meant. I said it meant nothing yet, or rather, that it meant someone had tried too hard to make meaning appear effortless. He laughed. exasperated, and said I saw conspiracies in grammar. Perhaps I did, but grammar is the skeleton of intent. It holds the posture of deceit. By evening, I found myself walking again through the college gardens. The air smelled of wet laurel and candle smoke from the chapel. Somewhere within, the choir rehearsed a motet. Their voices drifted outward, indistinct, but I thought I heard that same pure soprano note that had once halted me in the rain. It trembled, faltered, then resolved into silence. I stood for a long time beneath the dripping trees, thinking of ink and transformation, of the way two shades can appear identical until light betrays them. And for the first time, I wondered whether Claudia's death had been written twice, once by accident and once with intent. It was a Thursday when the choir sang again, Claudia Webb's memorial service. Oxford does these things beautifully, which is to say, decorously. Grief becomes an occasion for precision. Sorrow is measured in Latin syllables. The chapel at St. Barnabas was full, though I recognized a few faces. Academics tend to come to funerals, not from affection, but from etiquette. The air was heavy with candle wax and damp wool. Outside, the rain had resumed its slow argument with the city. I sat near the back, close enough to the door to feel uncommitted. Lewis, uncomfortable in his best suit, whispered that he didn't belong there. I told him none of us did. Julia Henslow read a passage from Ovid Metamorphoses inevitably. Her voice was clear, unshaken, almost rehearsed. The translation she used caught my ear. She read, "Music transforms the soul." I knew the line I'd seen carved beneath the stained glass window above the choir stalls, but the inscription there did not say transforms. It said betrays. I remember looking up at that moment, the candlelight wavering across the colored glass. The Latin inscription had always been faint, half eroded by years of polish and indifference, but it was still there for musica animam profit. Music betrays the soul, not transformed, betrays. It was a deliberate mistranslation, and that word prophet returned to me like a whisper from Claudia's unfinished crossword. Truth loses color. When the choir began, I heard it again, the same voice that had stopped me weeks before outside the chapel in the rain. The same note that had hung, impossibly pure, between earth and something like eternity. It trembled slightly now, as if aware of what it commemorated. The hymn swelled, rose to a fragile peak, and fell away. Fairfax was there, of course. He stood rigid among his colleagues, face carved into politeness. When the hymn ended, he bowed his head but did not cross himself. I watched him instead of the altar. He looked not at the coffin, but at Julia. She met his gaze once briefly, fiercely, then looked away. Grief and guilt are indistinguishable at a distance. After the service, I walked alone through the cloister, letting the procession of umbrellas fade behind me. The air smelled of lilies and rain. Somewhere, a bell tolled the hour, its sound breaking against the stone like a tired confession. Lewis caught up to me near the archway. He said Fairfax had spoken to Julia outside, something hushed and urgent. I told him to leave it. He hesitated, then mentioned that Rinaldi's name had appeared in a hotel ledger near Paddington 2 nights before. A single entry, no departure recorded. Vanishing men leave bureaucratic shadows. We crossed the quad in silence. The puddles reflected the chapel's windows, fragments of color trembling on the surface, red, gold, blue like meanings half understood. I stopped, looking back. From inside, the choir had resumed another piece, something older, more intricate. The notes drifted outward through the half-open door, light as breath. I found myself thinking of Claudia, of the photograph on her mantelpiece of the choir, her face turned slightly away, the smudge of a fingerprint across her shoulder. That smudge had bothered me once, now I understood why. It had not been dirt, but ink faint, rubbed from someone's thumb. The same dark shade that had traced the final version of her Latin note. I told Lewis I would stay behind. He left reluctantly, coat collar raised against the drizzle. I stood beneath the eaves of the chapel until the music ended. When silence came, it felt deliberate to rest in a score, not the absence of sound, but its restraint. Before leaving, I glanced again at the inscription below the stained glass. Musica animam prodit, betrays, not transforms. Fairfax had quoted it differently at his lecture. He had altered the meaning, softened it, excused it, and Claudia, with her relentless precision, would have noticed. The choir began one final refrain. I listened until the last note dissolved into the rain. Oxford, I thought, has always known how to disguise its sins in harmony. The Bodleian has a particular sound after dark, a sort of breathing, paper settling, wood contracting, footsteps reduced to memory. I've always liked libraries at that hour, when the scholars have gone and only their ghosts remain, lingering among unfinished arguments. That evening, I returned there not out of duty, but out of curiosity, that incurable itch that refuses to leave a detective in peace. Lewis had gone home. He'd offered, in that well-meaning way of his, to stay, but I told him I wanted quiet. What I really wanted was solitude, the kind that allows a man to hear himself think and perhaps regret it. The librarian, an elderly man named Camber, recognized me from previous intrusions. He gave a faint, nervous smile, then retreated, leaving me with the keys and a warning about locking up properly. I walked between the stacks, the light from my torch grazing the spines of books that had outlived their readers. Ovid, Catullus, Fairfax. His name was on a slim volume, a monograph on Latin transformations. The irony did not escape me. I turned the pages slowly, smelling the faint bitterness of dust and ink. Claudia Webb's annotations were their small, elegant notes in the margins. Incorrect metaphor she had written beside one passage. Further on, another in Latin. He mistranslated this deliberately. It was not an accusation, it was an observation, the calm precision of a scholar dismantling deceit. I thought of Fairfax's lecture, his polished cadence, the pause before his translation. Claudia had caught it. She had heard what I only felt, that subtle betrayal of meaning disguised as eloquence. In Latin, the difference between prodit and mutation is the difference between betrayal and transformation, between sin and scholarship. I closed the book and turned toward the reading desks. The rain tapped against the high windows, the kind of sound that makes time dissolve. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed 8. Poured myself a small measure from the flask in my coat pocket. Whiskey and learning have always shared an affinity, both burn, both reveal. As I drank, I noticed the register on Comer's desk, the borrowing log. Rows of neat handwriting, all the solemn order of a confession book. I traced the names down the column until one caught my attention. Julia Henslow. The same day Claudia died. 2 entries Ovid, Metamorphoses, Volumbud Secur and ink, archival grade, Venetian blue. Oxford is a city that prefers its symbolism, literal. I stared at the entry until it blurred. Venetian blue is the same shade as the second ink on Claudia's note. I imagined Julia leaning over the page, imitating her friend's handwriting, rewriting the line that had condemned someone she admired. I thought of the way she had read at the service, her voice steady, her grief too tidy. But deduction is rarely as clean as that. Guilt, in my experience, never belongs to a single person. It seeps, it stains. I moved toward the gallery, the wooden steps creaking beneath me. Below, The long tables stretched like pews, and the lamplight drew narrow corridors of gold along the floor. I stood there for some time, looking down, thinking how easily faith in language becomes faith in people, and how often both are misplaced. A movement caught my eye, the faintest shift of shadow near the entrance. I called out softly, and Comer appeared, apologizing for startling me. He said he'd forgotten his scarf. His voice trembled slightly, or perhaps it was the acoustics. I watched him leave again, his reflection flickering across the glass as he passed into the rain. Alone once more, I returned to the register. The ink of Julia's name was still slightly raised, recently written, but beneath it, another faint line, erased and overwritten. The name before hers had been Rinaldi. I replaced the book carefully and locked the desk. My reflection in the window looked older than I felt, or perhaps exactly as old. The city outside shimmered in the drizzle, its lights diffused, its meaning smudged. I left the library just before 9, the rain cold and persistent on my face. Somewhere behind me, a choir was rehearsing again, though I could not tell from which chapel. The melody drifted across the quadrangle, a long, slow lament without resolution. And as I walked, I thought not of Fairfax or Rinaldi or even Julia, but of Claudia and the faint, perfect line of blue that had outlived them all. The night before I confronted Julia Henslow, I dreamt of the choir again. The same voice, the same note suspended in rain. Only this time, when it broke, it did not fade. It became the scratch of a pen across paper. I woke with the taste of metal on my tongue and the faint certainty that the case had already ended. I had simply not caught up to it. Lewis met me at the college gate that morning, his face pale with the particular fatigue that comes from chasing ghosts through bureaucracy. He said Rinaldi had left the Ichi country, or so the embassy claimed. Fairfax, meanwhile, had cancelled his lectures. Oxford, when cornered, prefers retreat to confession. I told Lewis to wait outside Julia's rooms. Some conversations need no witnesses. She opened the door before I knocked. Her expression was neither fear nor surprise. It was something quieter, almost relief. The curtains were drawn, though daylight leaked through in hesitant lines. Books, letters, and a few cracked teacups lay scattered across the table. I noticed immediately a fountain pen with blue ink, the same Venetian shade as before. I said her name softly. She sat, gestured vaguely toward the chair opposite. I remained standing. She began to speak before I asked anything, her voice trembling only once. Claudia, she said, had been in love with Fairfax. She thought herself immune to that kind of weakness, but intellect offers no defense against affection, only vocabulary. Claudia had discovered Fairfax's deception that the circled joint paper with Rinaldi was built on stolen translations, Claudia's translations. She threatened to expose him. I asked what happened then. Julia stared at her hands for a long time before answering. Claudia had come to her the night she died, agitated, certain that the next morning she would confront Fairfax publicly. Julia had tried to stop her, not for Claudia's sake, but for Fairfax's. The man, she said, was not cruel, only fragile. That word again, as though frailty excused harm. There had been an argument. Claudia, determined Julia, desperate. A struggle, a fall. The hearth, the corner of the desk, something solid meeting something human. Silence, and then panic. Julia said she sat beside her for an hour before she could think clearly. Then she began to arrange the scene, the wine, the note, the diary. She wrote the Latin line herself, tracing over Claudia's old handwriting from a notebook, changing tempora to omnia. All things, not time. Because it felt final, she said. I could almost hear her logic, grammatical and remorseful. She had used the Venetian ink to make it seem foreign, romantic. She had signed nothing, of course, The letters hidden behind the shelf were hers as well. Drafts, fragments, a scholar's attempt to create coherence where there was none. I asked why she hadn't confessed. She said because Oxford forgives the dead and punishes the living. I remember the sound of the rain against the window, steady, measured, like an indifferent metronome. She looked at me then, and I saw not guilt but exhaustion. She asked if I would tell Fairfax. I said truth has a way of traveling without permission. When I left, Lewis was waiting by the gate, collar up, hands deep in his pockets. He asked if she'd admitted it. I said she'd told me a version. There are always versions. He asked what I believed. I said belief is the least useful tool in my trade. That evening, I sat by the window in my flat, the letter and the note side by side on the table. The handwriting no longer seemed identical. Julia's loops were wider, her pressure heavier. 2 hands, 2 hearts, one deception born of misplaced loyalty. I poured a glass of whiskey and let the rain blur the city into reflections. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, the choir rehearsed again. Lewis telephoned around midnight. Fairfax had been found in his study, an empty bottle of pills beside him. On the desk, a single sheet of paper, omnia mutantur, nos et mutamur in illis. All things change, and we change with them. Same ink, same hand, perhaps borrowed from Julia's pen. I said nothing. There are no victories in such symmetry, only endings that repeat themselves until silence becomes the only translation left. There are evenings when the city folds itself into silence, as though Oxford has grown tired of its own brilliance. That night was one of them. Rain hung in the air but refused to fall, and the lamps along Walton Street flickered with the weary patience of men who knew the truth too late. I sat by the window, a half-finished crossword before me, the glass of claret untouched. Lewis had gone home hours earlier, taking with him the last vestige of conversation. His departure had left behind a kind of equilibrium, the sort found in rooms where only one person is pretending not to remember. The newspaper on the table carried the headline I'd expected. Oxford, Don found dead apparent overdose. Fairfax, reduced at last to a paragraph. The article, brief and bloodless, mentioned that no note was found. But I knew better. There was always a note, it simply wasn't written for the living. The phone had rung earlier in the evening. Julia's voice, measured and almost kind, had asked whether she should come in for questioning. I told her there would be no need. The official story would hold a man of intellect undone by despair. Oxford preferred that narrative kept the stone clean. She said thank you, though what she meant, I think, was goodbye. I poured the claret at last, its color dark enough to suggest regret. The first sip was sharp, then soft like the case itself, I supposed. I thought of Claudia Webb, of the girl whose voice had drifted through the rain that first morning, the girl who corrected Latin as if the truth depended on syntax. She had died for her precision, for noticing too much. It is an affliction I understand. Lewis had once told me that some crimes feel like equations, neat and solvable. This one did not. It was more like a piece of music dissonant, unresolved, echoing long after the final chord. 2 lives ended, 1 ruined, the rest of us left to hum the refrain. I turned again to the crossword. 1 clue remained unsolved, a change that restores, or ruins 8. I traced the empty boxes with my pen, letting the word form itself. Mutation, change, transformation, betrayal even. The answer was all of them. Somewhere outside, the faint sound of a choir drifted from a nearby college. Not St. Barnabas, I think, but the same hymn, the same fragile ascent and inevitable fall. I closed my eyes, listening. For a moment, I imagined Claudia among them not as she died, but as she had been in that photograph, slightly turned away, unwilling to face the camera, as though aware that memory would demand too much of her. I poured the second glass more slowly. Rain had begun at last, soft and deliberate, tracing thin rivers down the pane. It made the city look almost innocent again. The investigation file lay open beside me, but I could not bring myself to close it. Some part of me feared that by ending it, I might disturb whatever fragile order the dead had made for themselves. Lewis would come by in the morning, bring the paperwork, and perhaps attempt small talk. He would notice the crossword, the claret, the silence, and decide rightly to leave early. We understood each other best in what was unsaid. I leaned back in the chair, the glass cool in my hand, and let the music fade into its final silence. There are cases one solves and cases one endures. This had been the latter. Claudia's Latin note still rested in the drawer beside me, its two inks faintly visible under lamplight, a confession written twice. I raised the glass slightly, a gesture without audience or intent. To her, perhaps. To the girl who corrected the gods. The rain strengthened, the choir fell quiet, and the city withdrew into itself once more.